Minecraft Snapshot 24W09 is here with some huge technical changes in Datapack version 33. If you're looking for the new UI and wolf armor changes, check out my video about the gameplay changes. In this video, we'll be diving deep into the Datapack changes. Let's get into it. Item stack data formats have changed everywhere in the game, both in inventories and other places where items are referenced in datapacks like icons of advancements. The format is now consistent and the same everywhere. The big change is that the NBT data found in the tag field has been structured into a new set of data components. This change has been made both to increase the performance of the game looking up item properties and to pave the way for future improvements to the game's support for custom content. The difference between the old tag data and the new components is that the component data is read and validated when an item is loaded, rather than later on when it is used. This both enables immediate error messages when some data is wrong, and increases performance for data that the game needs often, like armor trims. The ability to store custom data on items still remains. There's a new custom data component that can store any NBT data. Advanced tooltips now show the number of components of an item instead of showing that it has NBT data. All items are now represented with a namespaced ID, and where more than one are possible, a lowercase count. This includes the icon field of advancements, items in text components, and the result field in smelting recipes. The count field of an item can now be omitted, with a default value of 1 being used in that case. Air and count 0 are no longer used to represent empty item stacks. Instead, the item should just be omitted. In places where this is impossible, like in equipment lists, an empty object is used instead. One thing to note is that it is no longer possible to set an invalid count in order to get stacks of items over the max stack size for that item. The new components are stored in a new components field, which contains a mapping of component type to whatever data that component type holds. But note that components that are set to the default value are not stored. Default values for all items are now also generated by the game's data generator into the items.json file. Each item type has a template for which components that item should have. Component types can also be specified with an exclamation mark prefix mapping to an empty object, which causes that component to be removed from the item. We'll walk through all the component types in a bit, but let's first take a look at how this surfaces in various areas of the game. Item syntax in commands has been updated to give direct support for components. This means you can use square brackets, similar to how you'd write a block state, to specify component content. The old tag syntax also still does exist, but anything put into that tag is now placed into the custom data component and will not be used directly by the game. Item predicate syntax is also updated, so in /clear you can also specify component restrictions using square brackets. Any components you specify this way must match the existing data on the item exactly. Using the old tag format still works here too, which now tests against the custom data component and still does a partial matching like before. For loot tables, the setNBT and copyNBT functions have been renamed to setCustomData and copyCustomData. There's a new function called setComponents, which adds or replaces a set of components on an item. It has two fields. Conditions is a list of conditions to check before applying the function. And components is a map of component type to component data, much like for command input, and here too you can use a prefixed exclamation point to remove an existing component. Another new function is copy components, which copies components from a specified source to the loot item, and which is now used in the vanilla data pack instead of the copy name and copy NBT functions. It also has a list of conditions to check before applying the copy, and also a components field, which in this case is a list of component types to copy. Finally, it has a source field specifying the source to copy the components from, which at this point only has one possible value: block entity. Item predicates have also changed. The tag field has been removed, and the items field now supports either an item ID, a list of item IDs, or a hashtagged item tag ID. The potion field has been renamed to potions and also supports a potion, a list of potions, or a potion tag. The NBT predicate field has been renamed to custom data and now matches the custom data component. There's also a new optional components field which matches the exact data of components. Each component specified must match exactly the given data, but the item may also have additional components. Let's do a quick walkthrough of the available component types. We already talked about custom data. It stores an object of NBT, which the game itself never uses. The damage component stores a single non-negative integer value representing the damage to an item with durability, and replaces the damage tag. The unbreakable component can be added to an item to make it not lose durability when used. It replaces the unbreakable tag and can contain a show-in tooltip boolean, which by default is true. The repair cost component stores a single non-negative integer representing the additional XP cost required to process an item on an anvil, and replaces the old repair cost tag. The Enchantments component replaces the Enchantments tag but has quite a different format. The main part is a levels field which contains a mapping from namespaced enchantment ID to level. It can also have a show-in tooltip boolean which defaults to true. The stored enchantments component replaces the stored enchantments tag and has exactly the same formats as the enchantments component type. There's a new component type called enchantment glint override that stores a single boolean and which can be added to an item to override its enchantment glint, either forcing it to have it or forcing it not to have it. The custom name component type replaces the name tag inside the display tag and stores a text component in stringified JSON format. The lore component type replaces the lore part of the display tag and stores a list of text components in stringified JSON format. One change here is that this list now has a maximum limit of 64 entries. The adventure mode properties of an item can be found in two new components called can break and can place on, which replace the can destroy and can place on tags respectively. Both have the same format. Predicates, which is a list of block predicates representing the blocks the property applies to. These predicates can in turn have a blocks field, which is a block, a list of blocks, or a hashtag block tag ID. A predicate can also have a state field, which is a mapping of state names to the required value, as well as an NBT field, which is an NBT tag to match against the block entity data. The adventure mode components also have a show-in tooltip boolean, which defaults to true. Projectiles loaded into a crossbow are now stored in the charged projectiles component, which stores a list of projectile items loaded into the crossbow and replaces the charged boolean tag and charged projectiles list tag. One change here is that the list is no longer restricted to 3 entries. Those items in turn can have another new component called intangible projectile. This component stores no data, but when it is present on a projectile, causes that projectile to become intangible when fired, which means it cannot be picked up in survival mode. Potion data is stored in a new potion contents component. This replaces all of potion, custom potion color, and custom potion effects. This has an optional potion field for the type of potion. If this is set, all effects of that potion will be applied. Custom color can change the color of the item's potion overlay and the effect particles. And custom effects is a list of effect instances which are all added to the effects of the potion. Suspicious stew effects have their own component too, which replaces the effects tag and keeps the same format as before. Attribute modifiers now have their own component. The modifiers themselves are stored under the modifiers field as a list, where each entry has a type field, which is the attribute ID, previously known as attribute name. Each entry also has a slot, which can now be one of the equipment slots, but also any for any slot, hand for modifiers that work when holding an item in either hand, and armor for modifiers that work when wearing the item as armor. UUID name and amount still work mostly the same, although the fields are now lowercase. Operation has changed into an ID instead of a numeric value. The possible options are add value, which replaces 0, add multiplied base, which replaces 1, and add multiplied total, which replaces 2. The attribute modifiers component also has a show-in tooltip boolean, which defaults to true. Let's move on to container contents. Bundle contents holds all items stored inside a bundle and replaces the items tag. If this component is removed, items can't be added to a bundle at all. The format is a list of the item stacks contained. The container component holds the contents of shulker boxes in item form and is then copied to the shulker box block when the box is placed. This data used to be stored in the block entity tag as items. The format is a list of slots, each of which is a slot integer between 0 and 255, and an item field containing the item stack in that slot. For containers that have a loot table, that data is now stored in the container loot component, which replaces the loot table and loot table seed tags inside the block entity tag. The container loot component has two fields: loot table, which is the ID of the loot table to evaluate, and seed, which is an optional 64-bit integer field containing the fixed seed to use for the loot table. If the seed is 0 or not specified, a random seed will be rolled when the container is opened. The lock component contains the key data for a locked container-like block. It is a single string, which causes the container to only be openable with an item with a matching name. The block entity data component replaces the block entity tag and still contains unstructured NBT data, which is copied to a block entity when the block is placed. Data that has specific support in a different component is removed from this tag. The data must also contain an ID field with the block entity type. The block state component replaces the block state tag and is a map of property names to their values and can be used to force the state of a block when it is placed. Decorated pot sherds are stored in the new pot decorations component, which replaces the sherds tag inside block entity tag and keeps the same format, which is a list of sherd item IDs. The profile component replaces the skull owner tag of player heads. This can be specified as only a name, which causes that player's skin and ID to be looked up. Otherwise, full properties can also be specified. The sound a player head converts a note block into is stored as a sound event ID in the note block sound component, which replaces the note block sound tag inside block entity tag. Entity tag has been replaced with the entity data component, which stores unstructured NBT data that is applied to an entity when it is spawned by an item such as a spawn egg or an armor stand. The data must contain the ID of the entity type. The bucket entity data component contains the data about an entity stored in a bucket, like a tadpole or fish. This replaces the direct copies of some of the entity fields like no AI, silent, no gravity, glowing, and so on. All the replaced fields are now supported inside the bucket entity data component instead. Bees inside a bee nest or hive are now stored in the bees component, which is a list of bee entries and replaces the bees tag inside block entity tag. Each bee entry has an entity data object which contains the tags to merge into the bee when it leaves the block. This must contain an ID field. Each bee entry also has a ticks in hive integer and a min ticks in hive integer. The color of dyed items is stored in the dyed color component, which replaces the color tag inside the display tag. The format is an RGB field containing the integer representation of the color, and they show in tooltip boolean. Armor trim data is stored in the trim component, which contains a pattern, a material, and a show in tooltip flag, which replaces the trim tag. The custom model data tag has been replaced by a custom model data component, which contains a single integer that identifies the custom model. Banner patterns are now stored in the banner patterns component, which replaces the patterns tag inside block entity tag. This is a list of patterns where each pattern has a pattern field containing the namespaced ID of the pattern. These namespaced IDs replace the shorthand pattern strings used before according to the table on screen. The color field contains the dye name of the color, which is converted from the color integer used before, translations on screen again. The base banner color used when a banner is applied to a shield is stored in the base color component, which is a single color name. This replaces the base tag from the block entity tag and is also translated from a color number. The numeric ID of a filled map is now stored in the map ID component as a single integer. Any decorations on the map are stored as the map decorations component, replacing the decorations tag. This component is a map from a unique string name to decoration data. Each decoration data contains a type, which is now a name instead of a numeric ID as shown here. In addition, the X and Z world coordinates are also stored, as well as a rotation float, which is the rotation of the icon in degrees clockwise, with 0 degrees denoting up as north. This replaces the rot tag. The map color tag inside the display tag has been replaced with the map color component, which contains a single value containing the integer representation of the RGB color. The target of a lodestone compass is now stored as the lodestone target component, which replaces the lodestone pos, lodestone dimension, and lodestone tracked tag. The data is a block position stored as a pos list, a dimension field with the dimension ID, and an optional tracked boolean which defaults to true. The writable book contents component contains the contents of a book and quill and replaces the pages and filtered pages tags. This is now represented as a single pages field, which is a list of page data. Each page can be specified either as a plain text string of the page content, or as an object with text and filtered fields containing the raw text and filtered alternative. Written book contents is an expanded version of this for signed written books. The pages list for written books works the same way, except the contents are full text components instead of just strings. In addition, the written book contents also has title and author string fields, a generation field from 0 to 2 denoting how copied the book is, and a resolved boolean denoting if the text components have already been resolved, that is, scoreboard entries have been looked up, selectors inserted, and so on. When the resolved's value is false, the components will be resolved the next time a player opens the book. The explosions of a fireworks star are stored as the firework explosion component, which now replaces the type, colors, fade colors, trail, and flicker tag inside the explosion tag. Each explosion has a shape field, which is a named shape converted from the numeric format type used before, as seen here. The colors field is a list of RGB values in integer form, which will be randomly selected from, and fade colors is a list of the same format for the colors to fade to. Has trail is a boolean for whether the explosion has a trail, and has twinkle is a boolean for whether the explosion twinkles, which has been renamed from the flicker tag. A fireworks rocket has all its explosions in the fireworks component. This has an explosions list with entries of the same format as the firework explosion component, as well as a flight duration byte, which denotes the number of gunpowder used to craft the rocket. The instrument of a goat horn is stored in the instrument component that replaces the instrument tag and keeps the same format, a namespaced instrument ID. The hide additional tooltip component has been added, replacing the 6th bit of the hide flags tag. When present, it prevents the item's additional tooltip from being displayed. The recipes component holds the list of recipes unlocked by using a knowledge book and keeps the format of the recipes tag, a list of namespaced IDs of recipes. Finally, the debug stick state components replaces the debug property tag and stores the currently selected properties per each block type. Those are all the new components. You still with me? Wow, thank you for that. You're a true datapack mastermind for sure. We're not quite done, but please do drop a like on the video already. This is quite the effort, and each like does help out in the algorithm. So let's talk about some other data format changes that aren't strictly items. Tipped arrows now use the stored item for potion contents instead of storing it directly. And area effect clouds store a tag matching the potion contents component in a field called potion contents. The beehive block entity format has been updated to store bees in the same way the bees component does, and the flower paws field is now a snake case lowercase format. Banners now store their patterns in the same format as the banner patterns component, in a field called patterns. Villagers' trades no longer have the ignore tags field. Trades now have a component predicate matching damage instead. And the key item field can now be omitted for vaults, in which case the vault simply cannot be opened. An unrelated command change. The player and mixer channel are now optional for the play sound command, defaulting to @s and the master channel respectively. Attribute formats have changed in the attribute command to match the new names, and a bug has been fixed that caused attribute modifiers to not work if the first or last pair of ints in the UUID were both 0. Enchantment news in this version. Projectile weapon enchantments like Infinity, Multi-Shot, and Piercing now work regardless of which weapon they are on, if placed on those weapons using data manipulation or by changing the enchantable crossbow and enchantable bow tags. And speaking of tags, there's a new damage type tag in this version. Bypasses wolf armor for damage sources that cannot be absorbed by wolf armor. In loot table news, the loot table entry, which returns all items from a provided nested loot table, now has the field value instead of name. And this field can be the namespaced ID of the loot table, but can now also be a full loot table specified in line. The setAttributes function has been updated and now supports all the new slot arguments from the attribute modifier's data component. The operation values have also been renamed to match the operators in the component and command syntax. And if you have the update 1.21 pack on, there's a new loot table, shearing/bogged. Let's wrap up with some predicate changes. Block and fluid predicates have been updated, the tag field has been removed, and block and fluid have been renamed to blocks and fluids. The type of these fields is now a single block or fluid, a list of blocks or fluids, or a hashtag prefixed block or fluid tag. Entity predicates have been changed so the type field follows the same pattern: a single entity type, a list of entity types, or a hashtagged entity type tag. And location predicates have been updated, with biome and structure renamed to biomes and structures, and now supporting a single entry, list of entries, or hashtagged tag ID. And that finally has led us to the end of the changes in Datapack version 33. My name has been Sliced Lime, thank you for watching, I'll see you next time.